Hello, this is Daryl Ehrlich, and this is the Billings Gazette, and we are lucky today to be talking with Bob Nolte, a journalist, an editor, and he is going to share with us some reflections about being in 1968 at the Democratic National Convention, covering it for the Chicago Tribune. But before we start, first of all, thanks, Bob, for being with me today. I really appreciate it. Let's talk a little bit about, let's begin at the beginning.
Okay.
You're not a Chicagoan native. Billings is home, correct?
Right.
How did that happen?
Well, I graduated from Billings Senior High School, so I always, as a young kid, wanted to be a newspaper reporter and a writer. So I prepared myself. I traveled around the world for a year and a half with my grandparents, and then went to the University of Missouri. I got a Bachelor of Journalism degree, and these are the days when editors would come and interview people on campus. And I was fortunate enough to interview with the Tribune, and they hired me as a cub reporter. In 1964, I moved to Chicago with my new wife, and worked in Chicago for 10 years.
Okay.
And I remember, mostly in the 60s is when I worked. 1968 was probably the worst year this country suffered for a long time. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated in that year. And then the National Democratic Convention was held in Chicago on August 25th. And that turned out to be just a devastating event for Chicago to suffer through.
Right.
And was the undoing of Mayor Daley and his administration. He became a person of scorn for years after the convention was over.
Right. So now you had covered in these 60s, you had also covered when folks like Martin Luther King Jr. came to town
Right.
for marches. So you had not only a front row seat to the Democratic National Convention, you also had covered the figures of the 60s when they came to Chicago. What was covering Martin Luther King and the civil rights like in a place like Chicago?
Well, Martin Luther King was hated. I mean, he's an icon. Everybody loves him today. But in Chicago, in the 60s, 66 and 67, he was hated. Hoover was the head of the FBI, swore he was a communist. He came to Chicago to desegregate the housing situation, and he marched through Cicero. He was subject to rocks and bottles. I stood next to him when he was hit by a brick in Cicero, Illinois. We actually were advised by the FBI that they were worried he was going to be assassinated in Chicago. And of course that didn't happen. He was killed in Memphis. But we were on him 24 hours a day. When he came to town, reporters were with him 24/7. And I remember many a night at the Ebenezer Baptist Church listening to his speeches and his oratory. And it was an exciting time, and a lot of the reporters really got to know him pretty well. And I was fortunate to be able to call him Doc and occasionally have coffee with him. And I mean, he was just a plain, everyday guy.
Right.
And he was so hated that I think he clung to some of the friendships that he made. And of course, Abernathy was there, and Jesse Jackson, and they were all young men at this time, you know. And so it was a time that who wouldn't have thought he would become the great icon that he is today.
Because he was waning in some popularity.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was.
And people were wondering if nonviolence within the African American community was the answer, and something more militant may have been the answer. So he was not necessarily who. I think you make a great point. Was it? Did you believe when the FBI said his life was in danger? Did you believe it?
Well, they had a meeting with our editors, and they told the editors that they were worried about him being shot in Chicago because there were so many people opposed, white people opposed to what he was trying to do. He's trying to integrate the neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. And man, there was a tremendous negative reaction to him. And when he went through Cicero, they called out the National Guard to accompany him in his march through Cicero. I mean, they were afraid there would be snipers or, somebody
Right.
would take his life. But you're right. He had competition like Malcolm X and some of the other black leaders. The Panthers, the Black Panthers, were becoming well known at this time, and so he did have a lot of the black people really wanted to. They didn't think nonviolence was going to work.
Right.
They were apparently ready to turn to violent confrontations. So
What was, he's been lionized so much, and then there's also been reports of his own personal shortcomings. What did you make of Martin Luther King Jr., the man? I mean, in your interactions from him?
yeah, I mean, it was well known. He'd had a mistress in Chicago. I mean, that's a well-known fact. It wasn't at the time, but his history has, of course, dug up a lot of the things that he did. But the thing is, he was passionate about nonviolence. He was a follower of Gandhi and his whole nonviolent message, and he just didn't think that violence would win the day. And I think he was right. I think that his message, I think the violent stuff that happened in the 60s really turned people off.
Right.
And now there was more of a compassion. The Montgomery, Alabama bridge issue, they beat the heck out of those people that were crossing the bridge, and it generated a lot of support for what black people sought in those.
Right. It's hard to have compassion for the people who are doing the brick throwing.
Yeah.
It makes it clear, doesn't it? So tell me a little bit about. So let's work up to 1968. It's not like 1968 happens in a bubble. There had been unrest before then, right? Before the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. Mm-hmm. What was the climate like leading up to 1968 in Chicago?
There was a lot of tension.
Okay.
Because,
what do you mean by that?
Well, 9 months before the convention was held, Chicago was building up its forces to thwart the protesters coming, because there was so much publicity. We're coming to Chicago. We're going to upset the city. We're going to disrupt the convention. We're going to get on the convention floor and cause havoc. One of the things they wanted to do was they wanted to kill a young McCarthy delegate woman and blame it on the police. They wanted to march on the amphitheater. They wanted to sleep in Lincoln Park. They wanted parade permits for all the venues downtown, the streets, Clark and Michigan Avenue. They wanted to be able to march. The city gave them a permit to be in Grant Park. So the focus of the demonstration was Lincoln Park on the north, Grant Park downtown, and in front of the Conrad Hilton Hotel. The Hilton Hotel was the hotel for the delegates. All the delegates were staying there. In fact, the reporters were staying there. I stayed there with my editor. We had a room at the Hilton, and I was in charge of covering the McCarthy. I followed McCarthy for about a month before the convention, and his delegates. He had about 1,000 delegates at the convention, and there were about 1,500 delegates that were committed to Mayor Daley or to Hubert Humphrey, that were going to vote for him. And the thing that set off the riots in front of the Conrad Hilton Hotel is the McCarthyites wanted to pass a Vietnam plank, that they would end the war in Vietnam. Well, the Vietnam plank in the convention never succeeded. It was voted down like 1,500 to 900 or 1,000. And that really made the delegates from McCarthy angry, and the protesters. There were about 5,000 to 10,000 protesters in front of the Conrad Hilton after that vote was taken. I believe it was on a Wednesday night. And when that vote was taken, that set off the police riot. Cops took off their badges. They had their batons and their nightsticks, and they waded into the crowd and they beat them unmercifully. They chased them, they threw them into paddy wagons, and all the time television lights were on and recording this on videotape. It didn't go live. It was taped on video. It was on videotape, and during the convention, NBC cut away from the convention to show what was going on outside the convention hall. It was a melee. It started on Monday when a teenage boy climbed up on the statue in Grant Park and took down the American flag. And a whole phalanx of Chicago cops rushed in to arrest this kid that was taking down the flag. And that's what started on Monday the anger that was directed toward the police at the Conrad Hilton Hotel. You know, Darrell, the thing I remember the most, I think, is the tear gas.
Okay.
Just permeated the whole. I mean, they released in Lincoln Park. They had what was called a tear gas cannon. It was an actual cannon that shot tear gas into the park. It formed a very misty, kind of strange, almost a science fiction-like photo picture of the protesters. They were running away from the tear gas, and the cops emerged out of the tear gas and chased them out of the park. And at the Hilton, the National Guard came on Wednesday night, released tear gas that was so thick and so pungent that it drifted into the hotel. People had to shut their windows because it was going into the hotel.
There's a lineup where it didn't disrupt. I forget whether it was Humphrey in his shower.
Yeah.
He couldn't. He started gagging in the shower, I believe.
Yeah, right. He had to go shut the window because it was. That's the thing that caused your eyes to run and your sinuses, and it was just it was horrible. It was, the thing that's funny is that nobody died. After 5 days of this protest, nobody was really injured too seriously. There, 150 cops were treated for injuries. There were like 700 arrests during the week, and there were like 25 reporters that were beaten. Fortunately, I never got beaten, but the thing that was so difficult of covering this event was that the cops not only beat the protesters, they beat the reporters too, and we couldn't go join the protesters because they were as angry at us as they were the police. So we were in a no man's land. It was just.
Why were the protesters angry at the media?
Well, they thought the media was pro-Vietnam. They thought the media was, ancillary supporter of the war in Vietnam, and my newspaper was. The other newspapers, the Daily News, was not. It was anti-war, but they just took it out on us, and we weren't safe with them, and we weren't safe with the cops. So
right.
It made it difficult.
When you let's talk about a little bit about covering, because you had a up close look too, not only covering the DNC but covering Chicago. Let's talk about Richard Daley, the mayor.
Yeah.
What was covering Daley like? And he had been ready for almost. It seems like itching for the fight.
He was.
What was that? So let's talk about covering Daley and his administration, and then let's talk about spoiling for the fight, so to speak.
Yeah, he was fearful that these protesters would cause a lot of injuries and death in his city, and they started putting out, I don't know if it was propaganda or if it was fact, but they said that the protesters were putting black widow spiders in little containers and throwing them into the midst of the police. I never saw that. I don't know of any reporters that did see that, but they did throw nails. They threw bags of human excrement into the fire, and we did see that. They were promising they were going to terrorize the city, and the first thing that the mayor did was clamp down on. He would not let them sleep in the park. He had his cops roust them out of the park at night. It closes at 11 o'clock at night. They were forced out of there. There were press conferences that were held leading all the way up to the conference where Daley promised he was going to protect the city. He was going to call out the National Guard, and he did use the National Guard. He had thousands of police that were set around Lincoln Park and the Hilton Hotel. He prevented them from marching to the amphitheater. The International Amphitheater is where the convention was held. And that's down on about 41st and Halstead, I believe. He asked the National Guard to put a phalanx around the International Amphitheater. So, but he, was a kingmaker. He was very loved in the Democratic Party. He basically, I covered City Hall for a summer, and he was a very, what can I say, not well spoken.
Right.
He talked like a Chicagoan. He's like a blue collar guy. His police were all mostly blue collar guys facing protesters who went to Yale and Harvard and Ivy League universities and University of Wisconsin and some of the big Midwestern schools. And these were kids that never got in trouble before, a lot of them.
Right.
And here they were. They didn't know how to act. When the police gave them a command, they didn't obey it. They just, they weren't like street kids.
Right.
When a cop threw a street kid against the wall and told him to spread eagle, they would do it. They followed the commands of the police. But these kids were looked at like spoiled brats. That they were all, it was out of their element to be a
Right.
protester, and a lot of them came from the suburbs. And here was a clash of the blue collar and the educated young kids of that particular period in time.
Right.
And you have the blue collar mayor who sat in the convention hall and shouted down. Some of the delegates would get up and would provoke Mayor Daley and say, "Mayor Daley, call your cops out. What's going on out there in the street is un-American. Get those cops back into the station house or get them off the street and let these protesters peacefully protest." Well, Daley wouldn't do it.
Right. Were you, having covered Daley before this, not being one of you said 4,300 journalists that came in to cover the convention, you had covered him before. Were you surprised by his reaction?
Yeah, because usually in a city council meeting, he's pretty mild-mannered and, he watches his P's and Q's pretty well. But out there in the convention, he was like a mad dog. He had his son next to him. He had all of his police officials, and he was in his he was in his street mode, I guess is what you could say.
Right. Was he so? Leading up to it, a lot of people focus on the convention itself and on the riots, but what do you believe as a journalist, because you covered the campaigns, you cover this, do you believe there was legitimate fear to be on a heightened state of alert? Was that a legitimate fear?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
Yeah, it was. The protesters were hell-bent on causing as much disruption. They got into the Hilton Hotel. Some of them got into the convention hall, and they were violent, and they were throwing things, bricks, and there's movies of them picking up paving blocks and throwing them at the cops. And every time the cops would fall, was hit, they'd cheer, and that's really provoked. They cheer when a cop fell down on the ground and was injured, and it was a dangerous mob.
Right.
They were
both sides, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Because both were angry.
Yeah.
What was Chicago? Were you in Chicago during the spring and summer? So Martin Luther King is assassinated, and then Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. Were you in Chicago during those assassinations?
Yeah, I was in Chicago during both those assassinations. I didn't have anything to do with Kennedy.
Right.
That happened in California, of course. But King.
What was the reaction in Chicago when
the west side of Chicago just erupted. They burned the Sears store down. They burned the neighborhoods down. I was injured during the riots. Our car got hit by bricks and bottles, and we had to go to Pasadena Hospital to get treated and, for injuries because they were throwing things at the cops and one thing I'll never forget this, and I don't really talk about this much, but I was on the west side when they were burning the buildings down, and I saw a Chicago policeman shoot a black guy, shoot him down just in cold blood. And I went to call in this to my desk, and I said, I saw this. I witnessed this cop shot this guy, and the guy wasn't doing anything. He was just in the rubbish of the building. I said, I'm reporting this, and they said, we're not running it. We're not going to run it.
Did they give you a reason?
They said they just.
We're not running it.
Yeah, they didn't. They refused to do it, and I said, Darrell, at this time in the '60s, the newspapers in Chicago, I remember they called when a black person died, it was called a cheap death. That was a code. That meant that the guy was shot on the street, or he wasn't worth the coverage. There was racism
even in the coverage.
Even in the coverage, yeah.
What is that? So I wanted to take you back, and this is as good a time to ask this question. What does a kid who grew up and graduated from Billings Senior High think of this? Because while there are certainly issues that are in the 60s that hit Billings, we didn't have places being burned down, and I don't know that we had cheap deaths necessarily. What does a kid from Billings think of all this?
Well, I tell you, after 10 years, because one of the things they did is I went on the road and I covered rebellion and anti-war demonstrations on college campuses. Because I was young, I looked like a college kid myself. I fit in pretty good, so I went to the University of Wisconsin when they blew up the math building and killed a teacher. I was at Kent State before the National Guard was there, and Champaign-Urbana, the University of Illinois, and different campuses reporting on these anti-war demonstrations that had turned violent. So, after 10 years of this, I'd be teaching Sunday school on Sunday morning and covering a murder later Sunday afternoon because I was on the night shift. It was. I lived in Wheaton, Illinois, a little suburb west of Chicago, and my wife and I and our new kid, my daughter, tried to leave a suburban life, normal life, and then Senator Percy's daughter was killed, and I covered that, and I covered the Speck murders of the 7 nurses in Chicago, and it was just like my whole life was covering rape and rampage,
Right.
So after about 10 years of this, I tell you, to be honest, I prayed. I asked God, I said, God, you got to get me out of Chicago. This thing's killing me. I feel like Jekyll and Hyde,
Right.
So fortunately, I had a fraternity brother that was a newsman in Kentucky, worked for an NBC station, and I got a job down in Kentucky covering news in 4 states in the South, which was really interesting, and got into television news, and things calmed down a little bit, and life was more normal. It does something to you. When you cover this kind of stuff, when you see all this evil and all this murder and things that are going on, even today, Chicago is like a murder capital. 2 or 3 people killed every week, on the west side and the south side, and it's just, you can't live like that after so many years.
Yeah.
It's a price to pay.
Yeah. So I'm going to take you back to 68. One of the things that's interesting is you never, you probably, did you think that you were living through history when the Democratic National Convention was coming, or did you think to yourself, we're just going to cover this and be on to the next event, or let's talk about going into it.
Yeah, it felt like this was a historical event.
Right.
And the fact that there were 6,300 newsmen, 4,000 of them from out of the city, a lot of foreign correspondents from different countries, you got the sense that this was something that was going to go into the history books, and that you were part of something that was not very much fun to cover, and you didn't know if you were going to get hit with a brick at any time. And no, we knew it was a big deal. We knew it was a big deal.
So let's talk about covering the convention itself. What do you remember from the convention? We'll talk about the riots in just a bit, but let's talk about just the convention. What do you remember covering from the political side, or just being in there?
I didn't cover anything in the convention hall.
Okay.
I was strictly outside with the police and the protesters.
Okay.
Because the convention hall was a mile south. You remember, down by Halstead and 40th. So I didn't get in on that, but the political reporters handled most of that. The action, like one of the delegates said, the action is all out on the street.
Right.
That's where it was happening. What happened in the convention hall, there was turmoil there. Dan Rather was he was punched in the stomach, and John Chancellor, I think, was taken into custody briefly. So, I mean, that was dramatic in itself. And the films that I've watched of it, there were a lot of the delegates, there was a lot of infighting.
Right.
And but still, it was a lot safer than being out in the streets.
So let's talk about the riots. Now, it's been termed a police riot.
Yeah.
Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it is. On two different occasions, I believe the police actually rioted. They took their badges off, they waded in, they beat the crap out of these young people that were throwing bricks and bottles and human excrement and all sorts of good, golf balls with nails pierced through them. And there were, I believe I mentioned, there was 154 cops that were treated for injuries during the convention. But when the kid took down the American flag off that statue in Grant Park, that just infuriated the cops. They waded in and they beat him up pretty badly. And then Wednesday night, when the Vietnam plank failed, that's what set off the riot in front of the Conrad Hilton. Interestingly enough, on the 15th floor, room 1506, and I was kind of privy to this because I covered it, I'll never forget 1506, that was a McCarthy suite. Okay. And when the plank failed at the convention hall, the delegates that were in room 1506 opened the windows and started throwing chairs, ashtrays, beer bottles, bottles of liquor, out the window, down on the cops on Michigan Avenue, Michigan and Belbo. That night is the night that the crowd pushed against the cops, and the cops pushed them, the resistors, into a big bay window in the hotel's bar. What was the name of it? The Haymarket. The Haymarket. And the plate glass window crashed, and all the demonstrators rushed into the bar, and just turmoil throughout the hotel. Tear gas launched into the hotel, into the Haymarket bar. Meanwhile, on the 15th floor, the delegates from McCarthy, delegates are throwing stuff out the window.
It was chaos.
It was just unbelievable. You just kind of stood there and.
So were you on the ground, or where were you?
I was on the ground when the Haymarket went through the window. I was there witnessing that, and when the rioters rushed into the hotel, I got into the hotel and went up on the 15th floor because that's where I was supposed to be. But because they were really not doing anything but drinking and carrying on and watching television, I went down on the street because I thought that's where they would really need me more. But when I went up to the 15th floor, I went up with the cops. We all got on the elevators and went up to the 15th floor because the stuff was coming down. And so the cops went in there in room 1506 and started beating up on the McCarthy delegates, arrested some of them, took them out of there, so they closed the room up, and it was just destroyed. They had to close it up because of the destruction. So,
what did you think when you're seeing the the glass crash. You're seeing delicate I mean, not just hearing, but you are witnessing this as a reporter. What's going through your head at the time?
I'm thinking, it was just like, what is wrong with these people? I mean, they're acting like animals. Right. Yeah, not only the protesters, but the cops. I mean, everybody is just going wild. They're throwing punches. I mean, it's something I've never seen before, and since.
Luckily so.
Luckily so, yeah.
How do you even write a story about that? How do you approach that story?
It was difficult because there were other reporters. We had a task force of reporters because we kind of sensed that this was going to happen because of the behavior of the protesters in Lincoln Park, and so there were about 6 of us Tribune reporters that were staying in the hotel, and we were our city editor, Bill Anderson, was with us, and he would direct coverage. We'd meet, and then he'd direct coverage. Bob, you go out to Grant Park and be with that statue, because they're all the kids are all standing all over the statue, and something may happen there. This one would go down and be in front of the hotel, and we'd have to. And the hard thing, Daryl, was finding a telephone. Because, we didn't have cell phones,
right.
So there was a little, because I worked at the police station, which is right around the corner from the hotel, is the central police station. There's a bar there that I
yeah.
used to have dinner in at night when I was doing the late night shift, and there were phones in there, and that's where we made our headquarters for telephone. We didn't tell anybody else.
Right.
That was a real premium. Now, fortunately, there were telephones in the hotel, but the hotel was so there was so much noise and things going on that these reporters were phoning their stories, and it was pretty difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
When you when the mob happened at Grant Park, where did you said that you were an island. How did you, where was that island of safety, or what did you do?
Well, the cops were over on Michigan Avenue, and then Grant Park and the statue was several hundred feet away, as I remember. Remember, this is 50 years ago.
Right.
I don't know where exactly I was as far as, I think I was with the cops at that time, because it was kind of tranquil. The cops were, they were kind of keeping an eye on it, but they were letting them protest, and they were watching them very closely. But what set them off is when the young boy got up and shimmied up the flagpole and took the U.S. flag down, American flag down, and they substituted a Viet Cong flag, the black anarchist flag, and the Viet Cong flag, which is the red, I believe. And when that happened, the cops rushed him, and I stayed in back of the cops.
Okay.
So you got protesters, you got cops, and you got reporters who were in the background, kind of. But we could see what was going on. So.
Right. Did you fear for your safety?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
And I mean, we were defenseless. We didn't have helmets on. The funny thing about it, the Chicago police had these beautiful helmets, baby blue. Looked so peaceful.
Right.
Baby blue riot helmets. It was such a, yeah.
There was some standing around. Obviously you were going out amongst the protesters. You're with the cops. What were the conversations like on both sides of the fence as you're just standing there talking?
There was a lot of hatred. Cops were talking about, we're going to go in and we're going to get them.
Okay.
And I remember there was a U.S. attorney there. This is Wednesday night. There was a U.S. attorney, and these cops. This was a hardcore group of cops. Tom Foreign was the U.S. attorney's name. I remember. He got the cops to take off their gloves. They had these big rubber gloves, And inside the gloves were ball bearings and BBs and things that would make, like a,
Yeah.
what do you call nunchucks or whatever?
Nunchucks, yeah.
Yeah. And so these cops were going to go in and get these kids and teach them a lesson. And I remember Tom Foran, and this is on the videotape of this, but he had them take those gloves off and lay them down on the ground. He said, if you guys do this, I know who you are. I'm gonna take you to court. You're not going to do this. You're going to go in there professionally with your batons, break it up, but you're not going to use
You're not going to use gloves with
ball
steel
bearings.
ball
Yeah,
bearings.
yeah.
Did that shock you that they had ball bearings, or that they had those gloves?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it did. It shocked me too that they took their badges off.
Okay.
When they started taking their badges off, I knew that there was going to be blood spilled.
They did that. I mean, obviously, so they didn't want to
be identified. Okay. Yeah, they didn't, because they had a badge number on there, and people would. Now they didn't take them off all the time.
Right.
But it was during these times that they were going to surge into the crowd that they took them off, and they said that these badges can stick us or hurt us, so we.
but the ball bearings are fine.
Yeah, right. So that was the excuse.
So Bob, tell me a little bit about what were the conversations on you were out amongst the protesters at that time. What were they talking about? What did they say?
Pigs. We're going to kill the pigs. I mean.
So they were just as violent.
Oh yeah, they were very violent in their rhetoric. We're going to kill the pigs. In fact, Rennie Davis brought a pig. First day of the protests on Monday, they brought a pig. That was going to be their presidential candidate. Was a pig.
Yep.
And we're going to rout the cops. We're going to get into the hall. We're going to march to the amphitheater. And interestingly enough, David Dellinger, he had about, I think, 4,000 or 5,000 protesters that followed him because he wanted to be peaceful. He didn't want to do what Rennie Davis and Tom Hayden wanted. Tom Hayden would provoke the crowd. He would get up there. I remember the night that Wednesday night when the plank was voted, he got a bullhorn. He said, "We're going to die in the streets. If this is a place to die, if we're going to give our blood for this cause, prepare yourself. We're going to rush he provoked them to charge the hotel. Whereas David Dellinger, he wanted to march peacefully to the amphitheater to protest there. And on the film, it shows Dellinger and the police commander. And Dellinger is saying, I want to take this group of people and march down to Halstead and 40th to the amphitheater. And the cop would say, you don't have a parade permit? We're not going to let you do it. Some of them got there, and the National Guard had a phalanx around and wouldn't let them go there. And they had bayonets. They had missile launchers. When I was in the Army, they had a gun called the Law. It's called the Law.
Right.
I don't know if you remember it, but it was a little sawed-off thing, and it had 2 barrels, and inside that was like small mortars. And I mean, they were really bad. And these National Guardsmen would hold these missile launchers on the protesters, and they backed off and they went back to the hotel.
So when live television cut to the protests,
no, it wasn't live.
But when television news reported,
yeah,
and when this, and you're covering it, you probably didn't have time to stop and look at what the national broadcasts were feeding. After some of the, I don't want to say literally the tear gas had cleared, what did people think afterwards, directly after this kind of melee, this scrum?
Well, it went on till 3 or 4 in the morning.
Right.
These confrontations, and they would sing, and they would wave flags. There were instances in the park, in Grant Park, where people were having sex openly. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't leave. In fact, the next morning they found a lot of people just laying around, sleeping on the grass. So they were sticking with it. They weren't going to leave. And they were talking about the next day we're going to regather and continue to protest. And their rhetoric was, we're going to shut this thing down. We're going to shut this convention down. And I mean, they wouldn't give up. And you know, it was like 5 days of, and Daley called them terrorists.
Yeah.
He actually
which didn't help Matt.
No, it didn't.
Both sides are.
Yeah.
Did you so the convention happens, and history remembers this as kind of a blight, a dark spot, a low point.
Yeah.
Is that an accurate? I mean,
No,
how do you
so.
look at it? Yeah.
The Governor Daniel Walker, former governor, did a report. They had a commission that they put together after the fact, and in that commission report, he actually said that the police rioted in the ranks, and this was really the first time that I can remember that police acted so poorly, so badly. And because of that, I know after a couple of years after that, Chicago lost a lot of conventions. The Conrad Hilton Hotel was just a wreck. I mean, they had to almost refurbish the whole thing. It still is there today, but it hurt the city. It really did. I mean, and for several years after that, the business community was upset. The Democratic Party was in shambles. As you know, Nixon won the
Yes.
election that year, and there was delegates who were talking about the party will never be the same again. We're split in two. You know, I mean, there were almost as many delegates that were for McCarthy and against the war.
Yeah.
And it was a huge anti-war sentiment in the country. Not necessarily violent, you know, they weren't going to demonstrate against the war, but there were 300-400 young men dying every week in Vietnam. And one of the things that I did as a reporter, we covered every fatality in the war, the people from Chicago. I remember going to people's homes in the neighborhoods and asking them to tell me about their son who was killed in Vietnam. And we did a story on every one of them. I mean, a positive story about a young Chicago boy who gave his life in Vietnam. And that was, the paper, the Tribune at that time was very patriotic. As you saw, they fly on American
the black
flag.
and everyday black and white. The only spot of color was the flag,
American flag, yeah,
on the mast.
That flag does not fly on the newspapers anymore. Tribune is fairly liberal today.
Right.
But in those, our staff was.
That's part of it.
It was a Republican newspaper. Let's just put it was.
Yeah,
very Republican.
it sounds like it also to that cause. It wasn't just a name only. If it sent you out to cover every soldier death from Chicago, did you? Looking back on it now, how do you see that moment in your life? How do you see 1968 in your life?
Well, it was kind of. I've been at the Tribune 4 years. I started in '64, so almost 4 years, and I was. It was starting to wear on me. It really was, because do I want to spend the rest of my life covering events like this?
Right.
You know, and how positive is this? What am I contributing? What is my contribution to society? I mean, I think the newspaper does a lot of good, you know, but reporting on something like this has to be done. It's part of the job. You know, the Gazette doesn't like to report on police shootings and murders and stuff, but you have to do it. It's part of the job. And when you're able to do a positive story, you know, to help find a lost kid or a new breakthrough in science or medicine, those are the things that I think we work in journalism that we want to do, you know, that we want to cover.
Yeah. Did you, looking back on it, after you because you were a Chicago journalist and you stuck around after '68. Did the relationship between you and the cops change, or did you as journalists have to ask the tough questions of Daley, even though the paper was Republican? Was there a change in either how you interacted, or was there some questioning of the administration and why it did that, the Daley administration?
Not really noticeably. We still continued to have good relations with the cops. They recognized that it was the Walker report that said it was a police riot, not the newspapers.
Right.
They didn't fault us for covering the news. We did a lot of editorials supporting the city and the police. And the Tribune generally liked Daley, even though he was a Democrat. Daley made the city work pretty well for people until the '68 convention. And then Daley began to fall on hard times. People really never forgave him for what happened at the convention because he was such a hardliner. He was so hell-bent on his police force doing what they did.
Yeah.
Even though that a lot of voices cried out in the convention, Daley, back him off. Come on, cool him down. And Daley wouldn't do it. And that was kind of the end of his king-making powers.
The crown was tarnished, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it definitely was.
So, how long before, was it an instant thing that you thought you were covering history? Or, obviously, when people talk about 1968, they talk about the two assassinations, but or the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, but then they talk about you can't talk about 1968 without talking about the Democratic National Convention.
Yeah.
Did you, at the time, if you can take yourself back 50 years, did you think, I'm covering history here? What was your sense as a reporter covering this?
Well, you know what? I got into journalism because I wanted to cover history.
Right.
A newspaper is the daily history of a community.
Right.
And yeah, I thought we were covering history. When I do a story, that goes into the files for all time's sake. I have stories from 50 years ago. I have my old Gazette stories that I covered. That's history, And I always looked at journalism as being a chronicle. I'm a chronicler of history.
Right.
That's why I like journalism so much, because I think it's a very significant occupation to get into. And even today, even though newspapers are going through a tough time, you still, you depend on it.
When you were at Grant Park, did you? So you were kind of behind the police. How did you dare even go close to the melee with the protesters and the cops to get a better look, or how do you cover a riot?
Well, normally, like for an anti-war parade, I would walk right along with the protesters.
Okay.
When we went into Cicero, I walked right along. I got pictures of me walking alongside of Martin Luther King in Cicero. So I would stay with the protesters, and you just took your chance of being hit. Yeah, you could be hit with a bottle just like one of the protesters. And at Grant Park, what made it difficult is you didn't know if you're going to get a police baton in the back of the head, or a bottle in the back of the head. We hid behind trees. We hid behind cars. We crawled under cars and watched from that. Anything we could do to find cover, we'd do it. Right. And one guy got up in the tree. He thought that would be coverage. He got hit with a bottle up in the tree. They actually threw things at this reporter. I don't know why. Get up in a tree, but.
Right. So the media was under attack from both sides too.
Yeah.
But yet your mission is to accurately describe what's going. You have to be there to.
Yeah. I remember we got real friendly with a lot of the reporters, the TV reporters especially, and I remember this one wag. He said, you know what? They need to change the name of that Sunday show to Beat the Press, not Meet the...
What did you... was there anything in your career that had adequately prepared you to cover a riot?
No, not like that.
Right.
I mean, you always kind of depend on the cops to kind of protect you, or you can kind of hide behind the thin blue line. But in this situation, that wasn't going to happen for us. We just had to. One of the best things to do was to get behind a paddy wagon. You know, you knew that the cops were going to be just throwing kids in there. They weren't going to bother with you, but you could seek some protection that way. The guys that were really targets were the TV guys up in the trucks that were videotaping.
Right.
The crowd started chanting, "The whole world is watching. The whole world is watching," and that really turned everybody's attention to the television. And the cops, you know, I was almost expecting the cops to attack them. They didn't, thank goodness. I guess they knew that they'd be filmed doing it. So,
Right.
But I mean, I never forgot that. After the Vietnam plank failed, you know, the anti-war plank, all the delegates marched back from the amphitheater. They had a candlelight march after the convention adjourned. About 1,000 of the McCarthy delegates marched back to the Hilton Hotel candlelight march, and they were singing "We Shall Overcome One Day," and that was kind of moving.
Right.
Yeah, and when that group came into the hotel, everything kind of stopped. It was just kind of like silence. Everybody started singing "We Shall Overcome." Even the protesters. There was just like a period of tranquility as the delegates, the McCarthy delegates, went into the hotel. So it was. It's ebb and flow. You know,
Right.
There'd be bottles flying, and then
It sounds exhausting covering it.
Oh, it was just unbelievable. It was terrible. Yeah.
When you're actually trying to describe a riot scene, too, are you taking notes, or how do you actually
not
report?
a lot of notes.
Okay.
No, I mean,
Because it makes you
well, yeah, you couldn't watch for bottles flying. You know, you couldn't see what was coming at you.
Right.
And one of the hard things was, we'd go back to the bar that I told you we used the phones in this one bar, and we phone in all of our reports to a rewrite man back at the Tribune, and they would question, kind of like you're questioning me. Well,
Right.
did you see what else did you see? What were they doing? Well, you know, there was a group over there. They were smoking dope.
Right.
There was a run on cough syrups and butyric acid. You know what that is? That's that stink bomb.
Oh.
Smells like dead. You know, they put it in the heaters when you were a kid in school. They threw that into the hotel and got into the carpet, and it stunk so bad. It was just nauseating. So you'd see things like that, and you'd recall that, and you'd phone that in. Well, a couple of hippies came in with butyric acid and spilled it all over the carpet, and they had to close that area of the hotel off. And then when I was up at 1506, I said, well, McCarthy delegates are up there, and they're drinking, and they got kind of wild, and they started throwing things out the window, and you just have to relate everything that happened.
Did the rewrite man ever question what? I mean, because this is not your normal crime scene. Even if you had a call in to rewrite, did they ever go what? Or did they ever wonder what the heck it is that you were witnessing?
Yeah, I had this one rewrite man who was very questioning and suspicious, you know, because he wanted to know. I said, look, let me give you John will tell you he was right there too, you know, so we'd have to cross-verify things.
Right.
So, yeah, there was a lot of
disbelief.
What? Yeah, they're throwing human excrement in bags. Yeah, and that became, after a couple days, they begin to see that what we were telling him was true.
Right, but it
So-
took a little time.
It took a little time, yeah. I mean, it wasn't the kind of...
So what did you've got a wife and a child at
Yeah.
this time?
Yeah, and
And what are they thinking? Are you talking to them, or is she worried, or what?
they're pretty worried.
Okay.
They're pretty worried, yeah. And the fact that I was staying in the hotel didn't make it any easier. In
Right.
fact, that there were no cell phones. I used the bar phone to call home and say everything's fine, because they're watching this on TV.
Right.
And they're thinking any minute they're going to see their loved one getting crowned.
Head by, yeah.
Yeah. So it was rough on families.
Yeah. What's your if I just say now after 50 years, 1968, what did that come to mean for you? What has that meant to you now with a few
Well,
years on it?
68, because of the assassinations and because of Martin Luther King's assassination, that is the halcyon thing for me, was the Dr. King thing, because I knew him, because I had a relationship with him, and because I followed all of the things that he did in Chicago, because I went to church every night and heard him speak, and I met a lot of his friends, and I've shown you the pictures
Yeah.
of me with him and the real estate office. I don't so much remember the convention as I remember Doc King and what he did. And I guess when you asked me to recall the 68 convention, I was kind of surprised that you're doing a story about that 50 years later.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of surprising, because the highlight of the 60s for me was Dr. King, not the
Okay.
convention.
Okay.
The convention maybe it was so traumatic that you want to forget the trauma of something like that.
Right. Right.
But
Does history get the 68 convention right, that it was a crazy riot that was kind of an embarrassment? I mean, that's I think the narrative, if you read most histories or watch videos, was this was just crazy. This was a melee that should never have happened. Is that right?
I think so, because I think it all folds into the anti-war
A
story.
larger narrative.
Yeah, it's part of the anti-war, the shame of Vietnam, that so many people, even after, we pulled out of Vietnam in such a unorthodox way. It was such a different kind of war, that it was the first time we really lost a war, that we were defeated. And I think the 68 convention kind of folds into that whole anti-war narrative.
Right.
Just part of that history.
Yeah. So I want to thank you for sharing those stories, and I want to thank you for letting us in on. For those of us who have had to go back and watch the tapes of the '68 convention
Yeah.
and see it to understand what was there. Thank you for sharing the story. Also, thank you for your service in the cause of journalism and recording history too. I appreciate
Thank you.
that.
Enjoy it.
This has been Daryl Ehrlich with the Billings Gazette.